Google has postponed the release of the new Android 11 mobile operating system. A beta version of the new OS was supposed to be presented at an online event Wednesday. But widespread civil unrest in the U.S. means the unveiling is going to happen at a later unspecified date. According to a statement from Google, quote, "Now is not the time to celebrate." The tech giant is being sued by Arizona. The state's Attorney General Mark Brnovich claims that Google collects users' location data even after users choose to opt out of digital tracking. Google says that it welcomes the lawsuit, saying the AG is, quote, mischaracterizing the company's services. Quote, "We look forward to setting the record straight." Joining us to talk about this is Nicholas Thompson. He's the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine and a CBS News contributor. So first of all, thanks for being with us. I'm wondering, what is the basis of Arizona's lawsuit against Google? Do you think it's going to succeed?
Well, the basis of the lawsuit comes from a series of reports published in 2018, first I believe in the Associated Press, that showed that if you turn off location services within Android, it doesn't actually stop all of the ways that Google tracks you. For example, in Google Maps, it still would track you. You would have to turn off a separate setting if you open the Google Maps app on your Android device. So the large argument is that Google made it much harder for the company to turn off the company's tracking in every way. Google's defense will be, well, you still could turn it off. You could still turn off tracking in every app and in every way. It was just complicated. And then also later, Google did fix most of the problem. To your question of whether Arizona will win, I don't know. Google did do what Arizona is accusing it of. I just don't know whether that's a violation of the law.
Nicholas, that sounds rather sneaky to say you can turn it off, but you might not realize that by doing the first step, you still have to do the other 3 steps before it's actually off. So I'm wondering if you think that other states might follow Arizona's lead.
I think other states might follow Arizona's lead. I've actually been waiting for other states or the federal government to bring more charges based on this. Now, the cynical interpretation of what Google did is, yes, absolutely that. They made you think that you were turning off location tracking, but location tracking is so valuable to Google, they hid it so that the really valuable stuff they could still get. The less cynical analysis is, wait a second, Google's a gigantic company with 1 million different parts. And people use 1 million different Google services. It's incredibly hard to make sure you've turned off every form of location tracking in every single place. And of course, most people do want Google to know their location when they open weather or maps, because Google doesn't know where you are when you open maps. It's not very useful.
Sure. So I'm actually just wondering, Nicholas, if you're feeling more cynical or more forgiving in your interpretation.
So my interpretation is that Google set up every product without really caring about privacy. Then over time, they started to care more about privacy and they started to really think it was important. But it was such a hard problem to solve, they couldn't get all the horses back in the barn. So they're both taking the right steps and paying for some original sins. That's my interpretation, a mix of both.
That's some very good context there. Speaking of context, this is not Google's only legal problem. Tell us about the bigger picture here.
Well, Google's biggest problem is going to be an antitrust investigation from the Department of Justice. And that appears to be looking at advertising, but in a different context. It's not about location tracking. It's not about privacy. It's about whether Google is effectively manipulating the advertising market by controlling both the buyers and the sellers. That is a huge, huge deal. That goes forward, which it seems like it probably will based on recent reporting. Google has a gigantic federal investigation looking at the core of its business, not a relatively smaller state investigation, which it can probably get by with just paying some kind of a fine. The real risk for Google is that it gets broken up. And that isn't going to come from an Arizona lawsuit. That would only come from the DOJ.
Well, how does this impact federal regulators' interests in Google's activities then?
Well, there are a lot of federal regulators with a lot of interest in Google's activities. I mean, they're going after the ad market. They're going after other antitrust investigations about whether Google has used parts of its business to advantage other parts of its business at the expense of competitors. It's now going after Google on privacy. Google has about 100 different armies of regulators that are massing around its gates. So Google executive management has to spend a lot of time hiring lawyers, prioritizing where to fight, and figuring out what happens next. Up until this point, Google has basically been fine. They've paid lots of fines to Europeans. They've paid lots of fines because of lots of regulatory challenges. It is possible, though, that there could be more of an existential threat coming. What's interesting is that I think the pandemic has helped change the public perception to be a little more favorable towards Google. And antitrust investigations are partly political investigations. They're partly based on the law, but they're partly based on whether politicians think they can get benefit by attacking the targets. And so when the whole country hated the tech industry, it seemed more likely that there would be a giant antitrust investigation. Now that less of the country hates the tech industry, Google might be more protected.
You know, I remember a very early a very early edition of Wired magazine that had Google on the cover and their very simple motto. Can you remind our viewers of that motto? And I don't hear it very often anymore.
Well, the motto is "Don't be evil." And the problem was every time Google did something that people criticized, the motto would be thrown back at them. And it became a little bit hard for them to hold it up as a slogan, because every time they'd say, "This is our motto," someone would say, "Well, what about A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K?" I mean, they became one of the largest, and at points, the largest company in the world. And one of the most interesting questions about Google is whether the initial spirit of openness, collaboration that helped create this incredible company still stands. And there was recently an interview between Stephen Levy, one of the original writers for Wired, and Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, where Stephen asked that. He said, "Is Google still googly?" And of course, Sundar Pichai would say, "Yes, of course it is. We've retained those values." But it's also unquestionably the biggest question for the people who run Google. When you have something this big, this powerful, with this much influence over the way the world thinks and acts, can you be open? Can you be benign? What are the risks? So that's a big, big topic of debate inside of Google and outside of Google.